All right, let's get rolling here. Welcome to this 5-part webinar series called How to Overcome the 5 Biggest Blocks in Your Mary Kay Business. It's a series that's only for Mary Kay consultants. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but the concepts are going to apply to anything really and everything. But since this is a Mary Kay series, I'll give my examples just for Mary Kay. I'm not going to be able to catch your questions as you say them on this webinar, so I'm not going to see them till the very end. So if you do have a question, you can write it down, or you can type it in, but I'm not going to be able to see them and address them until the end. So this webinar is going to go for about 30 to 45 minutes or so. I'm going to teach you what I know to be true about the inner game of success. I've been working with Mary Kay directors, consultants, nationals for many, many years, over 13 years now, actually. And so we're going to talk about the fear of failure in this one. And we'll start with how all fear is created and how all fear is then uncreated. We'll talk about how to identify what your actual fear is, how to clear your fear of, it says rejection, and it should be failure. Sorry about that. And how to get individualized support. So the expectations, you can download the handout. Let's see if I can send it to you. And as soon as I do that, you are going to see my screen. Hopefully you have access to download the handout on the console. I sent it via email. It was also in the posted it on the Facebook group. If you don't have the handout, don't worry about it so much. You can download it later and fill in the blanks and so forth. Write your questions in the box, in the chat box. If you have them, I'll address them later. But my suggestion to you is that you just take notes of inspiration. Don't just try to jot down everything that I say. You're going to have access to this recording afterwards. I want you to capture the thoughts that you have. That's going to be a lot more powerful and a lot more implementable and more important than what I have. And for those of you that are in the Pink Caddy coaching group, feel free to share in that group, or you can share on the main page as it shows there, Pink Caddy Coach. Actually, I would rather you share on Pink Caddy Coaching in the group that we've been going along with. So what's possible? You know, a lot of people don't really understand what's actually possible in terms of making changes in behavior. I think most people feel like all they can do is cope with whatever it is that they're currently dealing with. And the truth is, you can actually clear away your fear of failure instead of just coping with it. You don't just have to try to avoid the things that trigger it. We can take a look at what's the cause. And if you're willing to, we can dive in and actually remove the majority of it, or at the very least, remove how much it controls you. And it can be relatively quick if you're willing to do the work on yourself. And quick is obviously a comparative term. So it could take days, it could take weeks, it could take months, but it'll be faster than not clearing it, that's for sure. And it definitely doesn't have to take as long as it took to create it and cement the fear. And once you get rid of the fear of failure, you'll be able to attract more success, and you'll be able to attract people in your business. You'll be able to take more actions instead of letting that fear control you. As long as you're willing to do what I'm going to share with you and actually take consistent action. So what's possible in the Mary Kay world? Anything, everything. Antonella said her income tripled immediately when she got rid of her perfectionism. We'll dive into that in a future webinar in this series. Koti said that she did 28,000 in production in a single month, but more importantly than that, she found balance in her life. And Gigi said she paid off 8 credit cards. She increased her income or her retail sales by $3,000, got her first 5 team members, etc. So once you get rid of this fear, the control that this fear has on you, it frees you up to take the kind of action that everybody really wants to take. And so the problem that I've learned and studied over the last 13 plus years is that you already know what to do, but this fear is causing you to not do it. I don't think there's anybody on this line that doesn't know the actions to take to build a business, but it's these fears, these sabotaging patterns that cause us to not take the actions. And what I've learned, and nothing I say in this whole series is ever meant to be a knock on Mary Kay or demeaning in any way to anybody in the company. This is all just human behavior problems, right? But I use Mary Kay examples because that's who this is for. So please don't think that I'm saying anything negative about the company specifically or any of the leaders or anything at all. What I've learned is that most people, in this case consultants and directors, are looking for the solutions in the wrong place. And so if you don't have the target in the right place, then even if you do what you're trying to accomplish, but your target is placed in the wrong spot, then the best you can do is get good at a misplaced target, right? And coping with the fear of failure when most people are going to say no to you in this business is basically it's settling for less. I mean, if you have a fear of failure and you're in any kind of business, or you're pretty much in any area of life that deals with interacting with humans, you're going to fail more often than you succeed. And so if all you can do is try to avoid that failure, you're going to be severely restricted. And I just think, that if we can remove that restriction, then you'll be so much more liberated for sure, and you'll feel so much better throughout the whole process as you go along this journey. And as I said in the beginning, it does not have to be this way. A lot of people identify with their fears and they say, I am a perfectionist, or I'm a procrastinator, or I always am afraid right before I pick up the phone. And if you identify with those fears as though the fears are you, then it's going to be very difficult to change them. But the reality is these fears are not you. These fears are things that you've just picked up along the way, and they can all be dropped. I'll get into how we do that in a little bit. So what I've learned in working with Mary Kay is obviously you don't want to feel restricted by the fears. You want to be inspired to work your business daily, or if you're not doing it every single day, at least you're not being held back by the fears. You're working it intentionally as much as you want to. You want to attract high quality people to you. You want the confidence and the clarity about what to do and say. And you want it to be fun. If you're not having fun in this business, then something is misaligned. This business is supposed to be fun. Fun is actually the best recruiting tool that you have in your business, way more powerful than your intellect or ability to overcome objections or anything else. And it's got to be simple. If it's not simple, most people are not going to do it. And people are certainly not going to want to join you if it's not simple. And so obviously you join this business to have some freedom, you want to make some money, and you want to do it while keeping your personal life in balance to an extent, right? Before we get into the dissecting of the fears, let me tell you a little bit more about me. That's me and my family on the black beach of Hawaii, the black sand beach of Hawaii a couple years ago. I'm a father and husband first. Those three right there are why I live and breathe. I'm a speaker and coach second. My wife is Sybil. My daughter is McKenna. My son is Exley. When I was 13 years old, I was hit and killed, nearly killed. I actually was not killed, but I was nearly killed by my next door neighbor in a hit and run accident. And the details of the accident probably, or by the details of the accident, I probably should have died. He was doing 50 miles an hour. I just pulled right out in front of him. He didn't slow down at all, and I survived. And apparently I wasn't done. And it taught me a lot about the the fragileness, I don't know if that's a word, but how fragile life is, and that it can be taken from us in any second without warning. And so I made some promises to myself. The big one being that if I only have one shot and I don't know when I'm going to be taken from this planet, then I'm going to do everything I can to make it my best shot. I just never wanted to look back on life and wonder what could I have become. And so I've really been driven by this fear of regret ever since that moment in 1986, regretting not working harder in life or regretting not doing whatever I needed to do to get out of my way and to achieve the things that I wanted to achieve and leave a legacy here and create an impact on the planet. And I know every single one of you have made some kind of a promise to yourself. Otherwise, you would have never joined Mary Kay. People join Mary Kay because they have ambition, because they want to do more with their life, because they want to encourage and enrich other women. So the fact that you join Mary Kay means that you want more, and I honor you and celebrate you for that. And if you're anything like me, just joining Mary Kay and just making certain choices and promises to yourself isn't enough on its own. So most of you, if you're like me, you've struggled. You don't know why. You sabotage yourself at times. Even if you know what to do, you're not sure how to get yourself to do it. So that's just the human journey. And I was beating my head up against the wall for many, many years until 2005, which is when I had this massive breakthrough with a life coach. And I decided that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a speaker and I wanted to be a coach and help people get through their belief barriers, because that's what Matt helped me get through in 2005. And 1 year later, as I was going around local organizations here, teaching some of the stuff I was learning, I kind of fell into the pink bubble and haven't left since. So I'm very well versed in the Mary Kay world. I've been pretty much studying the business, the mindset of the female entrepreneur, and specifically the Mary Kay consultant and director ever since then. And I want to teach you what I've learned, and I want to simplify it for you. That's the big thing. We live in a very complicated world, and when we try to make changes, we as humans tend to complicate the changes that need to be made, and we tend to complicate the process of making those changes. And one of the goals that I have for you in this series is to see the simplicity of what needs to be done and the simplicity of removing a lot of the behavior patterns that are sabotaging us, because it's really not complicated. It's just challenging. It's not emotionally easy, but it's not complicated, and there's a big difference there. I'll get into that as we go along. So how do we identify our fears in the first place? I think a lot of times we identify with certain fears, certain behavior patterns, certain labels. But sometimes those labels are so vague and generalized that we don't really know what our actual fears or what our pinpointed fears are, what are with clarity. And if we don't have clarity on what our fears are, then it's going to be very difficult to change them. So, for example, this isn't really a fear issue, but a lot of women think that they have self confidence issues, and my experience is they do not. Most women have self esteem issues. And while a lot of people lump those two things together, they're actually very different. And if you believe that you have self confidence issues, you can spend a lot of time and energy working on your confidence, and it won't solve the actual problem, which is a self esteem problem. So if we don't know with clarity what our actual fears are, we just lump them all together, then we're not going to be able to make any specific changes. So one of the things I want you to do is start observing yourself with a lot of intention so that you can identify your specific fears as best you can. So notice your tendencies to retreat. When you go to make phone calls, when you go to warm chat somebody, when you just go to do anything in your business and you feel yourself wanting to retreat, wanting to go eat, wanting to take a nap, wanting to do anything else that will pull you away from this activity. Follow-up calls is another one. That's a big retreat inducer for a lot of Mary Kay ladies. Whenever you notice yourself wanting to run away and retreat, just pay attention to that. What is the thing that you are telling yourself you need to do? And what's the thing that you'd rather do instead? There are a lot of garages that get cleaned and laundry that gets done and dishes that get washed instead of making follow-up phone calls or instead of doing the work that you need to do. And as you notice, I want you to follow your train of thoughts. Your thoughts are very indicative of what your beliefs are and ultimately what your fears are. So if you set out to make follow-up phone calls, let's say in the evening, and your thought is, oh, I don't want to be pushy, I don't want to interrupt people while they're while they're eating dinner. So you don't want to make the phone calls at 6 o'clock because they might be eating dinner. And then 7 o'clock rolls around and you don't want to make the calls because you might be interrupting dessert. And then 8 o'clock rolls around and you don't want to make the calls because they might be eating late. And then 9 o'clock rolls around and you don't want to make the calls because it's 9 o'clock and now it's too late. And here it is, you've missed this 3 hour window. At every step of the way, there's a thought that you're scaring yourself with. And the more that you notice those thoughts as an observer, the more you can catch them, capture them with neutrality rather than through your own current perspective. Because if you just look at the world through your own current perspective, you'll justify everything. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that we're seeing the world through our current perspectives and fears and beliefs and all of that. So we want to be as neutral as possible as we watch ourselves. And notice that, or understand that fears come in two different varieties. Some fear is positive, actually, and some fear is negative. The positive fears actually serve your highest good. So I mentioned earlier, I'm afraid of regret. We all are afraid of regret at some level. Some people just aren't aware of what they're afraid of regretting, or they don't remind themselves of this fear. But the fear of regret is actually a positive fear, and it'll get you to take action because you're more afraid of not taking action and not knowing what you can create than you are of taking action and failing. So that can be a positive fear if you use it. And then the negative fears are the ones that keep you stuck in your current comfort zone. Those are the ones that we mostly are talking about. And those are the ones that if we pay attention to, we're never going to grow. So the more that you observe yourself, I think it's really important to understand the doer, understand the person, not just the doing, not just the behaving, but understand the behavior, who's doing the behaving. The more that you can understand yourself and you understand the fears that you have, the better you'll be in knowing what the answers are, or at least knowing where the targets are, and the easier it will be to detach from your programming, which I'll get into in a little bit. So how are all fears created? In order to understand the three main fears that I'll talk about in this series, the fear of failure, rejection, and success, we need to understand fear in general. So fears are not signs of weakness or birth defect or something that you can eliminate entirely. That's not how fear works. Hang on one sec. Sorry about that. I had to click on something and I knew it was going to take my slides away. So fears are not any of those things like a lot of people think they are. Fears are just simply protection from something bad happening. We have an unconscious mind which has as its highest priority to keep us safe. And that comes in two forms. Physically safe, basically to keep us alive and uninjured, and then emotionally safe, to keep us from feeling bad. When we think there's a possibility of us feeling bad, then our unconscious mind will form some kind of layer of protection to keep us from feeling bad. So, for instance, I deal with a lot of people who say they have a fear of public speaking. It's one of the most common fears that people have. And the fear of public speaking is really about you speaking in public in some way and something bad happening. You forget what you're going to say. People don't like you. People hiss and yell and throw tomatoes or whatever the fear is, right? But if you don't imagine something bad happening, then you can't be afraid of speaking in public. You can't be afraid of heights unless you imagine falling. You can't be afraid of flying unless you imagine crashing and probably dying in a plane crash. You can't be afraid of warm chatting unless you're imagining something bad happening. If you ask somebody something about themselves or ask them for their name and number, and if you can possibly offer them a way to improve their life. I mean, think about that. So many women in Mary Kay are afraid of inviting women to improve their lives. Now, we'll break that down as the series goes on as to why we create that kind of a specific fear. But warm chatting is the opportunity to allow somebody to change their life. And if you're afraid of that, then obviously you're focusing on something bad happening, because that by itself has nothing bad in it. It's only when you think about how people might respond or what you might not say that you create this idea that it might go wrong. So all of our fears are the illusion that something bad might happen, and then we try to protect ourselves from that. So if we have a fear of public speaking, that fear will keep us from speaking in public. And if we don't ever speak in public, then we can't mess up while speaking in public, right? That's the way the fears work. Now, of course, they keep us from doing a lot of the activities that we otherwise want to do. So they keep us from succeeding, but they actually perform what their intention is. They always work for what they're intended to do. But what you have to understand is, because fears are protective by nature in the way that I just explained, the fear actually gets attached to the activity when we're not afraid of the activity. So again, we're not afraid of flying, we're afraid of dying in a plane crash, but then the fear gets attached to the flying. You're not afraid of warm chatting, you're afraid of something happening after you warm chat, but then the fear gets attached to the activity of warm chatting or making phone calls or follow-ups, and then we think that we're actually afraid of phone calls or that we're afraid of talking to people, we're afraid of making follow-ups. You're not afraid of those things. You're afraid of the outcome of those things. And the reason that's important is that if you don't remove the fear source, then all you can do is remove the trigger. What I mean by that is, if you don't remove your fear of failure, then all you can do is try to avoid doing activities that might lead to failure. Now, in Mary Kay, that means you can't do anything except maybe buy inventory, because I don't know, I mean, what kind of failure you could experience there, unless the internet crashes or something. But other than that, pretty much everything in Mary Kay involves the potential risk of failure. And I'm putting that in quotes. You can't see it, but failure is an illusion. Failure is a construct of our minds. Failure is a judgment. And so we can find failure wherever we want, or we can choose never to find failure if we don't want to, because it's a judgment that we place on something. So rather than you just trying to avoid anything that could potentially lead to failure, which means you also have to avoid anything that could potentially lead to success, then I'd rather you remove the source of the fear. And the source of the fear is really going to be internal. What is it that you're doing inside your head that's creating the fear? Now, I'm going to dive into that in a moment. When we go after these solutions, or when we challenge our fears, we will almost always produce doubts. That's the way that our brain works. When we try to challenge our comfort zone, our brain uses doubt to try to get us to stop, so that we don't challenge this comfort zone that our protective layers have worked very hard for a very long time to keep in place. So when you are challenging your comfort zone, the doubt and the internal resistance and the negative head talk is more often than not confirmation that you're going in the right direction. Yet what I find is that most people are expecting to change their behaviors smoothly. They want to change their behaviors without any internal resistance. And I'm just telling you, that's never been done. The human brain doesn't work that way. And yet, almost everybody is not just hoping that's the way it happens, they're expecting it to be easy, totally pain free, no resistance, no doubts whatsoever. That we can just make a kind request of our mind to turn off the fears of failure and rejection and turn off the patterns of perfectionism and procrastination and all those things just because we've made the request. It doesn't work that way. But most people succumb to the discomfort of personal development when discomfort is a requirement of personal development. So I think there's a lot of sadness in that people expect it to be easy. So when there is some resistance, they quit. And yet, when there's resistance, you're actually doing it the right way. And a lot of times, you're very close from the actual solution, but the discomfort causes people to quit. And what's sad about that is the discomfort of change causes a lot of people to choose not to change and then deal with the negative effects that they wanted to change in the first place. So, since it's uncomfortable to try to change our patterns, we just settle with the same patterns that we don't like for the rest of our lives because we don't want to deal with the discomfort of changing them. So, we'll just deal with the discomfort of not changing them forever. And that's not a good choice, in my opinion, especially if you want to liberate yourself from the patterns that you've created over the course of your lifetime. And there's not a single human that I've ever met that cannot change their fears. Nobody have I ever met. And I heard their story or I heard where their fears are, and I just thought, yeah, we can't do anything about that. Never, never have I ever met anybody who cannot uncreate and reprogram their mind. But most people choose not to for all kinds of reasons. The discomfort one being probably the biggest one. And then a lot of people don't want to pay for anything. They just want their lives to change miraculously because they've made a request of themselves. And as awesome as that would be, it's just simply not possible. And what I find is that most people are trying to do the impossible. They misunderstand the way their brain works. They misunderstand what's required to change fears and beliefs and what's required to change habits. And so they just end up settling. And it truly is probably the saddest thing in my business to see somebody who can absolutely shift if they wanted to or if they were willing to, and the fear causes them to not confront their fears, which is kind of I don't know, ironic, I guess, that we succumb to the fear of getting rid of our fears. So I want to share with you 3 quick intellectual questions that you can ask yourself when you deal with fears coming up. As you notice the thoughts that you have in your head, you can ask yourself, how likely is that to actually happen? So I used an example earlier of not wanting to make phone calls because you might be interrupting people's dinner. Number one, how likely is that to happen? A lot of times our fears aren't likely at all. And so if the fear is not likely at all, then there's no reason for us to hold on to it. And if you're concerned about bothering people, then maybe you remind yourself that they don't have to answer the phone or answer the text. Like everybody is able to protect their own schedule and their own activities. Or maybe you remind yourself that people eat dinner at different times. And even if some people are eating dinner right now, you can, if they answer the phone and say, "Hey, I'm eating dinner." Now, very rarely, in my experience at least, will people answer the phone when they're eating dinner if they don't want to be bothered while they're eating dinner. But let's say they do. And they say, "Yeah, why are you calling me? I'm eating dinner right now." I have actually seen somebody that did that. It's like they just wanted to be mad, I guess, and wanted to kind of yell at the person. But for the most part, people are just not going to answer. And that's fine. You just call back later. But if you challenge the fear and say, how likely is it to happen? And the answer is no, it's not all that likely to happen, then there's no reason to hold on to the fear. But let's say you have a fear that is somewhat likely to happen, then you ask the next question. If it happens, how bad will it actually be? And a lot of times our fears are just scary because we don't challenge them. We don't actually ask what would happen if this fear actually presents itself, or if the thing that we're afraid of does happen. And most of the time, what we're actually afraid of is just not that big of a deal. I mean, so what? You ask somebody if they want to give you their name and number and they say no. How bad is that? That on its own isn't bad at all. Now, what you say to yourself after that, that's where the bigger challenge is. But the actual situation of somebody telling you no, or giving you a wrong phone number and you call them and the person's not there, they never answer the phone, that situation itself is not dramatic. It's not devastating. It's the internal game that's doing all the work, right? So let's say that you have a fear that is likely and it's really bad if it happens. Then what you can ask yourself is, how temporary is it? And it's important that you ask yourself, how temporary is it? So you focus on it being temporary instead of it being permanent. Most fears, I would say 99% of the time, fears are either not likely to happen, or if they happen, they won't be bad, or if they do happen and they're bad, they're temporary anyway, which means you can make a new decision. And so most people are holding themselves back with temporary, shallow fears that just truly aren't that big of a deal. And yet we succumb to them and we allow these temporary, shallow fears to wreak havoc in our lives long term. So a temporary, shallow fear creates long term, deeply painful circumstances in our lives. That just doesn't make sense if we look at it that way. But it's because we don't challenge the fears enough to understand them. And then we don't really go about untying the knots that we've tied up ourselves. So one of the things that helps is if you really ask these questions as though you're a curious, maybe borderline, I don't know the best word, like the attitude of a teenager. I was going to say attitudinal, and I don't know if that's a word, but a curious teenager that has some attitude. When you challenge your fears like that, then most of them will actually fall. Now, I've heard several different acronyms for fear. I created one on my own based on what I believe is important to actually get rid of fears or get rid of the control that they have on us. And it's not just the understanding of fear, like false evidence appearing real. That acronym aims to understand that the fear is not real, but it doesn't tell you what to do. So I created an acronym that tells you actually what to do. So the F stands for face. You have to face the fear. You have to confront it. You have to acknowledge that you have the fears. As best you can, you have to capture them, as I was saying earlier. Just notice the thoughts that are going on in your head. You've got to embrace the fact that you have fears. If you have fear, that means your brain's working properly. Again, most people think that the way to become super successful is to get rid of all your fears. That's the way to become psychopathic. That's not the way to become successful. All humans have fears. So it's fascinating to me that so many people think it's even possible, let alone part of the journey, to get rid of your fears. So embrace the fact that you have the fears. Most of the fears that keep many of us as entrepreneurs stuck, and definitely a lot of Mary Kay ladies stuck, are fears because you actually care. You don't want to be pushy. You don't want to disrupt people. You want people to be happy. And so some of your fears are based on that. It's based on you caring. And you can just embrace the fact that it's based on you caring and then still want to change the fear. So one of the things that's important is that you cannot change anything that you haven't embraced. You can't change something that you're pretending you don't have. And pretending you don't have it's not going to ever make it go away. So I'd rather you understand that you've created some fears along the way and then do something to change them, rather than just pretend that you're not afraid of the things you actually are afraid of. The A stands for act. That's going to be the way to get past or through, or to not allow pretty much all of these fears to hold you back, is to take action anyway. The more you act, the less time you have to focus on whatever the outcomes are if they're negative. So if you make 10 phone calls over the course of a year, and every person, those first 9 phone calls tell you no, and you sit on each one of them for a couple months before, or a month or so before you make the next phone call, you're just going to be miserable. But if you make 10 phone calls in 20 minutes and the first 9 say no, but the next one says yes, those first 9 won't affect you very much because you immediately got up and acted again. So taking action is always going to be one of the most important ways to get around the control that the fear has on you. And then finally, R is release. And there's all kinds of things you can release. You can release your attachment to the fear. You can release your fear in general, just kind of give it away. You can release your expectations of that fear never coming back again. You can release the expectations of what your journey is supposed to look like, etc. And releasing is a lot more powerful of a word than avoiding or ignoring or just pretending something isn't there. So remind yourself to face, embrace, act, and release, and you'll have a lot more control over your fears. Now, the fear of failure specifically is a judgment problem, and it's usually based on an unhealthy comparison that triggers the belief, I'm not enough. Almost everybody has the belief, I'm not enough. And when we trigger that belief, then it usually causes us to be afraid of trying anything that will lead us to fail, that would then make us confirm that we're not good enough. So the fear of failure is a judgment. Failure is not a universally recognized term that everybody believes in or everybody could define the same. Failure is different in different situations, and it's different for each one of us individually. So if we're making up the judgment of failure anyway, then we can always not make it up, or we can make it up in a different way. And one of the ways we can do that is redefine how we even see failure. So I came up with another acronym of FAIL, which stands for finding answers in life. The only way to find answers is to take action. When you take action, you risk the outcomes not being what you want. Some people call that failure, and then they are afraid of it because they judge themselves. Or other people call that feedback, and they just realize, all right, well, now I have more information. Now I know that somebody's not interested in the business, or now I know that I've got this issue showing up when I talk to women, and now I get to deal with that. You know, if you just have as much as possible this neutral observer that notices what happens when you take certain actions, then you won't fall so emotionally hard when it comes to whatever results you get. And the truth is, if you're failing, that means you're taking shots. That means you're trying. The way to not fail is to not try. And this is what I was saying earlier, that if you can only avoid the triggers of failure, then the only thing you're left with is just don't try. And I think we all understand that that's not the best choice, right? So I've alluded to this, and I want to just take this one step deeper into clarity. When we're afraid of failing, what we're actually afraid of is not the activity, but what we're going to say to ourselves after the activity, after the failure. So you're not afraid of warm chatting, you're afraid of what you're going to say to yourself after warm chatting and the feelings that that's going to produce. It's the pain-filled thoughts that create the painful emotions. Remember, the fear is of the emotion. We're afraid of experiencing the painful emotions. Well, the painful emotions are created by our pain-driven and pain-filled thoughts. So if we can remove the thoughts that we are saying to ourselves, then we'll remove the emotion. And here's the cool thing. If you stop beating yourself up after the failure, you literally cannot be afraid of taking the action. And so the real true solution is to remove the self-abuse. And the way you do that is by connecting to yourself, as well as your passion and your purpose. If you stay connected to yourself, your passion, and your purpose, then you won't have any reason to beat yourself up. You can't do both of those two at the same time. You can't stay passionate about who you are and compassionate with yourself and beat yourself up at the same time. So if you just choose to stay connected, then the self-abuse won't happen. Now, that doesn't mean you're just going to turn a switch and you're never going to beat yourself up again. That would also be very difficult. But if you get a little bit better, then you're moving closer toward the actual solution. So I want you to understand that the real problem here is the self-abuse. It's not the behavior. It's not the fear. It's the self-abuse. The fear is created from the self-abuse. Actually, the fear is created to protect yourself from the self-abuse. And again, the way that it works, even though it might not make logical sense because it doesn't sound rational, but the way that it works is if your mind can scare you from taking certain actions, then it thinks it's protecting you from the negative emotions that might happen after those actions. And then we succumb to that fear and we go, okay, well, we'll never take those actions, but then we're dealing with the negativity all the time now. So the real solution, understanding that all of our fears were created as layers of protection, the real solution is to understand that it's not you that needs to change. It's just your programming. We've all created programming throughout the course of our lives. Now, what we created and when we created it and how we created it is different for all of us. But it's literally like once upon a time when we were younger, we decided to put a blanket over ourselves to protect ourselves from the outside world or from certain specific scenarios in the outside world. And that blanket is where all the fears are. That blanket is where all the sabotage is. The way you put that blanket on and what the blanket is and when you did it and why you did it and how it's how you're holding on to it now and how it's controlling you now, those are all unique to you. Each and every one of us is a very unique collection of memories and beliefs and circumstances and experiences that literally have never been in that same combination before, nor will they ever. So each and every one of us is a unique scenario. We are a unique, complex human. We're a unique, very complex being. And so the solutions need to be unique. There are some concepts that help, but if we're wanting to actually unwind our personal fears, those have to be personal solutions. Now, most people don't want to do that. They just want one size fits all. They want it to be simple. They just want the rules. What's an affirmation that I can remember, or what's a very quick misdirection technique that makes the fear go away? You can't make the fear go away. You can pretend in the moment that the fear's not there and sweep it under the rug and try to act anyway, but that's not getting rid of the fear. That's just trying to overpower it in the moment. And overpowering the fears in the moment won't make them go away. But we can, if you understand how the brain works, we can actually remove the fears and remove the some fears can be totally removed, and the ones that can't be completely removed, we can dissolve them so much to where they just don't stop us anymore. Now, I've been doing this work for 13 plus years, as I said. I've been studying coaching. I've been studying the unconscious mind and sabotage and all the ways that we create the behavior patterns that we have. So the real solution, in my experience, is what I experienced when I was at the event in 2005, is a personalized approach. And so my invitation to all of you is a free 30-minute phone call with one of my trained, certified coaches who knows this work very well. She knows the Mary Kay world very well. And she will help you get on the phone. There's no obligation to buy anything. And she'll just help you identify what your unique drivers are, what your personal blocks are, and what your solutions are. A one size fits all approach does not work long term. Now, it's not what most people want. And so it's almost a risk for me to invite people to take a look at themselves, because almost nobody wants to do that. But if you're not willing to take a look at yourself, then all you can do is cope with all those programmings, all those layers of protection, all those fears. So we want to give you the experience of what it's like to actually remove those fears. And because a lot of people don't understand what's actually possible, we want to give you that experience instead of just giving you some kind of expectation. So you can book a free call, pinkcattycoach.com/book my call. A little while ago, that was actually not working. So if that link is not working when you try to go there, you can replace Pink Caddy Coach with Coach Sean Smith. We've had some issues on our websites. There's some viruses, and so things are getting moved around. And this is just one of the URLs that was getting moved around, and it got changed recently. So if it's not working when you try to go in there, then you can go to coachseansmith.com/book my call. And it's a gift that you can give yourself of really truly understanding yourself. But you're not going to be able to just look in the mirror and go, oh, okay, I know why I have all these fears. You can't do that, because that's using the perspective that created all the fears. And one of the things that I've seen for so many years in this world of personal development is people trying to fix their own problems with the same mind that created the problem. And you just simply can't do that. So, I think if you're serious about identifying what the actual issues are, and the other thing is, a lot of people think they know what the issues are, and then we start asking life coaching types of questions and neurological transformational kinds of questions. And sometimes people are blown away of what their fears actually are. Sometimes they are nothing like what they thought they were. Sometimes they're way more shallow. Sometimes they're a little bit deeper. But very rarely, I don't even think it's ever possible that somebody identifies what their own fears are and then overcomes them. So, give yourself that gift of putting yourself under the microscope a little bit and allow somebody who's trained, that understands the way the brain operates to produce all these fears and all these sabotaging habits, to not only help you identify what the target is, but actually do something about it. I teach something called neurotransformational coaching, which is the experience of transforming your neurology, meaning we have fears, we have limiting beliefs, we have experiences, we have memories, we have traumas, we have decisions, we have all these things that are actually inside of our bodies. They're inside of our physical bodies, they're inside of our mental bodies, they're inside of our states, and unless we can make changes in our bodies, then we're not actually going to make long-term changes. So some people have fears and they'll go through a coaching experience with us and their fear literally is gone. They can't find it anymore. They can't even connect to it anymore. And the hardest, I would say the hardest thing that we have, that I personally find, is convincing people of what's possible, because so many people have just been coping. So many people have not really truly understood or not been willing to make profound changes in their neurology. So one of the things that I really want you to understand, again, I said it a few minutes ago, is that you don't have to change. It's just your programming that has to change. But you won't be able to change your programming by yourself because you're the one that did it. Hopefully that makes sense. I want to make it as clear as I possibly can. And if your current level of programming is not allowing you to make phone calls, then you have one of two choices. Do what you have to do to change the programming so that you will allow yourself to make phone calls, or stop pretending you want to make phone calls. Either one of those is a viable, valid choice, but you can't not change the programming that's stopping you and expect you to get through it. You just can't do that. Although 99% of the people are taking that option, right? So that's the main question that you have to ask yourself is, are you willing to change the programming that is not currently allowing you to get the goals that you have? And if you're not willing to change the programming, that's totally fine. Just stop beating yourself up for going after these goals that you're not willing to change the programming to allow yourself to do. So in the end, you will likely not care all that much about whether you achieved your goals. The biggest question you'll ask yourself is, did you go for it? Did you try? That's what produces emotion for people, whether they tried something. That's going to be the biggest the biggest question, I think, as we look back on our lives, that we determine as it relates to success, right? We'll have other questions as it relates to our faith and as it relates to our family. But as it relates to success, we're going to ask ourselves, did we do everything we could while we were here and while we had a chance? And if you can answer that question positively, yes, I did everything that I possibly could, then whatever you created will be fine. But if you didn't do everything that you possibly could, then you'll have regret. That's what regret is. So hopefully you can see the fork in the road. You can either cope with the fear of failure or you can clear it away. It is possible to completely clear it away. Let us help you doing that. I think it's a profound gift you can give yourself when you understand yourself and you identify what can actually provide liberation for you. I think a lot of people are living their lives in prison, in a mental prison. I know that's how I felt for the longest time. And it wasn't until I had that experience that I talked about in the beginning that I understood life can be different. Wow, that just created some emotion in me. Life can be different. Because most humans don't think life can actually be different. And if you don't think life can be different, even though on some level you want it to be different, if you really truly don't know how to make the changes, then you don't have the hope that it will be different. And that is a profoundly sad state of mind. So the question you should be asking is not what's the cost of taking action, but what's the cost of not taking action. So there's no pitch. I don't have a link for you to go buy anything on this webinar because every game plan is a personal one. So give yourself that experience of identifying what your personal blocks really truly are and your experience of having a neuro transformation. And if that's all you want, then great. If you want more support, then you can talk about that on the call. But sorry for this. It probably sounds like it's driving right through my office. Some big siren coming through. Or maybe that's the siren telling you that it's time to change. I think we all need to listen to the signals that are telling us that we can't continue the way we've been operating and expect different results. I mean, we hear that all the time as the definition of insanity, right? Yet so many people are not willing to do anything that they haven't done before, and yet they want something that they haven't gotten before. So let us help you. Let us help identify what you can do. Let us give you some solutions. Let us give you an experience of what a neurotransformation can actually be. And I can't wait to hear how that lands with you. So we have 4 more of these master classes, these webinar series. We'll dive into the other 4 topics: the fear of rejection, the fear of success, procrastination, and perfectionism. If you have any questions, you can respond to the email that I've sent out. You can put it in the Pink Caddy coaching group or message me any other way. I hope this has made sense to you. I hope it's been helpful and valuable to you. And most importantly, I hope you're able to implement some of this and give yourself some freedom in your business and in your life. So with that, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your evening, and I'll come to you in the other classes in this webinar series. Take care, everybody.